Hi, I'm Rachel Kramer Bussell, editor-in-chief of Residence 11, which you can find at residence11.com. We're a website and community that celebrates sensuality, romance, intimacy, and loving in a new age of human connection. Welcome to our monthly author series, where we'll be interviewing authors and highlighting their work. And today we have a trio of authors. I'm going to be talking to Dedeker Winston, Jase Lindgren, and Emily Sotelo Matlack, who are the authors of the new book, Multiamory, Essential Tools for Modern Relationships, which will be out May 23rd. Dedeker, Emily, and Jase created the Multiamory podcast in 2014 to raise awareness, provide approachable resources, and combat the stigma faced by people in non-traditional relationships. Today, with hundreds of episodes, millions of downloads around the world, and a rapidly growing community, they are dedicated to offering practical advice and communication tools grounded in the latest relationship research, guest experts, and years of professional experience. Multiamory has been featured in numerous publications, including NPR, Vice, Huffington Post, Oprah Daily, Cosmopolitan, and Elle. In addition to their national tours, they have presented at the Google campus in Seattle and have been keynote speakers and presenters at numerous conferences. Find out more at multiamory.com, and you can find out about their book at multiamory.com/book. And make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're watching this so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming interviews. Okay, before we get into the podcast and the book, I want to go back a bit to your growing up. What did you learn about sex and relationships? I mean, however you want to discuss that, whether that's at home, school, from friends and peers, or pop culture. And then we'll get into multi-amory after that.
I think my answer is going to be a little bit different than the two of theirs because I grew up with, I think, a pretty open household in terms of being allowed and able to express myself and what I was interested in, and talk to my mom, who is a single parent, about things like sex and relationships. And that was really wonderful for me. And I do think that it really cultivated an interest in those things at a very young age. And just knowing that I had the opportunity to even go there. I started dating, I think, when I was, a young person and a freshman in high school, and obviously had a lot of different feelings about what I was interested in. I also realized, even early on, that there was the possibility to be attracted to more than one person at once. And I thought that that was really interesting, even though I think monogamous culture tells us, and told me from a very young age as well, that no, you need to only be with one person and that's it. And that's the way that things are. So it's interesting, even from then, I kind of was questioning that a little bit and wanting to see what was beyond just the realm of only compulsory monogamy.
I think my answer is maybe the polar opposite of that, in that I was raised in the backwoods by conservative evangelical Republicans. So I grew up really heavily steeped in purity culture, to the extent that, when I was a young person, I signed 2 of those pledges that say you're not going to have sex until after you're married. I signed 2 of them, so I always joke that like I'm in breach of contract with God like twice over now. So yeah, pretty much all of my education about relationships, about sexuality, was primarily from the church. And look how far I've come.
And I guess for me, I'm maybe closer to Dedeker's side, but maybe a little bit more of a middle ground there. Was also raised Christian, and was one of the many kids who read the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and like really had this kind of glorification of being a virgin until you're married and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like I had parents and generally grew up in like a suburb of Seattle, so a more liberal area. So I think I had more balancing influences with that, where it was more of a like, if you're attracted to, other boys, that's like we'll still love you. Like, we don't know how God feels about it. It's like sort of a middle ground there of like, we don't know if this is cool or not, but like, we're cool with you at least. And then, and then being involved in music and musical theater and stuff in school, kind of getting different exposure to other ways of being and thinking about things, but still very much grew up with this, pretty normal monogamy is the only way to do things. There's not really another option besides being a bad person. That's your only other way you could go about things. So I'd say that I'm kind of sort of somewhere in that middle ground between Emily and Dedeker.
So segueing from those different backgrounds, when and I guess how were each of you first introduced to polyamory, either as a concept or as a practice? And did it intuitively make sense to you when you heard about it? I mean, Emily, you touched on that, or was there a learning curve, or was there kind of an internal struggle? And for this and the other questions, if you all want to answer, that's fine. Or if one of you has wants to take it on. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering who had their like earliest non-monogamous experience or feelings. I don't know if we've ever compared. Yeah, you, Emily?
Well, I just want to put it out there. Like, I was a child who was a product of an affair, so I knew that like non-monogamy in some sense or another was a thing that was out there, even though I think that a lot of people associate, non-monogamy immediately with cheating, and that's clearly not how we think of it. And that if it's ethical or if it's consensual, then that's not what we're going for. But I definitely know that I saw versions of that almost immediately from birth, because my father was never married to my mother, and my mother, was dating multiple people to try to see if she could find a dad for me, and that never worked out. So I think it was, in essence, sort of viewing that from a very young age, but I didn't really understand or know about the concept of polyamory until Jase and I started dating and embarked on that much, much later in life.
Yeah, I'll just kind of jump in on that part of the story there. So Emily and I were together for a few years monogamously first, and then we ended up opening up our relationship partway into that. And at the time, like, we didn't know the word polyamory. We didn't really get that that was a thing. We didn't know anything besides that we wanted to try something different, try to figure something out that would be a better fit for us. And then through that, met people who recommended books, looking for podcasts. There weren't really any. There was one other polyamory podcast before we started ours back in 2014. But for me, it was that thing of, there's been this part of me that has wanted something like this, or felt like there must be a good ethical way to do this, but I never thought it was possible. So it was always that, well, gosh, if only I lived in that fantasy land where having some kind of ethical way of having multiple partners and not being so controlling or jealous was possible, that'd be great. But oh well, that's not the world I live in. So for me, it was very much this like, oh, it is like, there are people that do this and have done this for a really long time, actually. Wow, this is amazing.
Yeah, for me, I think the earliest time that I can recall having some sort of non-monogamous / polyamorous feelings was when I was probably a pretty young teenager, when I was at the point of first starting to explore, play around with quote unquote having adult relationships and so forth. And I was in my very, very first relationship ever, just a few months in, and suddenly had this experience of developing a crush on someone who was not my partner at the time. And the really sad thing is that, again, because all of my messaging around relationships either came from the church or maybe Disney movies, I really had this belief that, oh, if you're in a relationship with someone, but you're attracted to someone else, or you get a crush on someone else, or you're interested in someone else, that must mean the relationship is bad, or it must mean that you're bad. And that was kind of the one that I chose at that tender age. Was I kind of thought, oh, I'm bad, there's something wrong with me, because everything that I learned about relationships and love and sex had taught me that if you really love someone, you have blinders on. Like, you don't even think about anyone else, you don't feel attraction to anyone else. Like, that was a huge gap in my education growing up. So I spent many, many years going through this cycle of, pretty classic serial monogamy, where I would develop crushes on other people, and either I would just kind of spiral and get really depressed, feeling like, oh my God, this must mean something horrible about the relationship that I'm in, or it must mean something horrible about me, or doing what I think a lot of people in our culture do, which is, oh, this must be a sign it's time to move on to this next person, right? And so just kind of hopping from one monogamous relationship to the other until in my early 20s, I was finally so sick of the cycle. And my best friend suggested to me, have you thought about an open relationship? That was probably my first time ever really interfacing with the concept seriously. And because at the time that he suggested it, I was actually offended, a little bit offended, because I associated open relationships with, like, I don't know. I was like, oh, that's only for people who are sex addicts or people who don't actually love their partners or aren't actually committed to their partners, right? So I was like, took some offense that he would even suggest it, but I still went home and Googled it. I still went home and suddenly found myself really compelled to start diving down this research rabbit hole. And for me, as soon as I was presented with the concept, presented with the fact that, oh, there are people out there practicing polyamory in a way that is healthy and consensual, as soon as I knew that there was that social proof, like, totally made sense to me. It completely resonated with the way that I had felt since I was about 13 or 14. Now, going beyond that into how does this actually work? Well, that wasn't necessarily intuitive from the get-go.
So in some ways, Dedeker, I think you kind of answered this, but do you all feel like if polyamory had been presented as a viable option to you earlier, you would have explored it in your lives sooner?
Oh, I think so. As a teenager, I mean, if you'd taken me out of the concept of being raised in the church, like, and I was in an environment where it would have been socially acceptable to explore that, yeah, totally. I think that if at that moment that I'd had that experience of, oh wow, being attracted to multiple people, and someone had come along and told me, hey, this is something that you could try, I totally would have done it.
Yeah, same for me.
I feel like there was definitely a time in my life where I was trying to be monogamous because it wasn't the thing that was given to me as what I grew up with. And so I was like, oh, well, maybe I will find somebody that I fall in love with in high school and then end up marrying and living happily ever after with. So to a degree, especially in high school and maybe even in college, I was thinking that that would perhaps be the way that I went, but that definitely didn't happen. So
Now, your podcast is called Multiamory, and your book is called that. And in the book, you define multiamory as multiamory represents multiple forms of love, everything from monogamy to non-monogamy, casual dating to queer platonic, married couples to those who are single by choice, and everything in between. So can you talk about a little bit about what that concept of multiamory means to you and why you've centered your work around that, and also how multiamory is different from polyamory, or how they intersect?
Yeah, I do want to clarify a little bit that we're not putting multiamory out there as a word to say, like, this is a type of relationship in the way that polyamory or monogamy or relationship anarchy is like a type of relationship. The title originally started, originally our show was just about polyamory, and the title came from a joke. It's this joke that someone sends me at least once every year. If someone posts this thing about, oh, polyamory is wrong, combining Latin and Greek roots is wrong. It should either be polyphilia or multiamory. And so that's kind of where the title came from in the first place. And what I think we really lucked out, though, in picking that name instead of picking a name that has polyamory right in it, is that as our podcast grew and our own relationships changed, we were able to grow and expand the podcast so that it's about relationships more generally, but for anyone who acknowledges the fact that there are different ways to do it, and just because you choose one way to do it or one way works for you or your partner, that doesn't mean that that's the only way it can work, and it doesn't mean that one is more morally right or more ethical than another. So that's why we mentioned specifically conscious monogamy as a contrast to compulsory monogamy, or that idea that you're monogamous because there's no other choice versus being monogamous because you choose to. So I think for us, the idea is that we've been able to expand multiamory to be something that includes all those different types of relationships, as long as they are conscious and you're thinking about them and making intentional choices about how to have good, healthy relationships.
Yeah, it is kind of a funny thing that sometimes people freak out a little bit in confusion, because I think language and labels move so quickly and change so rapidly these days that, yeah, we do get people who are like, oh, wait, it's multiamory now? Oh, gosh, what is that? Okay, all right, you got to get me up to
Yeah.
speed. Okay, what is multiamory? Which is not necessarily exactly how we're intending for the term to be used. But it's, we're in a landscape creating resources and looking into research and trying to tailor relationship advice within a landscape where, if you think about quote unquote relationship books, relationship podcasts, like relationship advice shows, the mainstream culture by default hears relationship and we equate that to mean, oh, that means monogamously married or dating on your way to being monogamously married. And that's what that means. That's our tiny little container when we think about relationship. And so for us, in creating that definition and putting that on like the front plate of our book, was more about trying to expand to include the wide spectrum that relationships are taking much more visibly these days, that it's not just these particular models anymore, that within the scope of modern relationships, we think it's this much broader spectrum that's maybe not quite as black and white as like all the mainstream monogamous folks over here and then all the polyamorous weirdos over here in the corner.
Plus, I think that assumes that people are and relationships are one or the other over the whole course of the relationship, without acknowledging that it could switch and switch back.
That
and
too. Very good point.
or be open
Mhm.
to switching. That could be on the table, even if you don't actually, whether you start out non-monogamous or monogamous. I think going to what you said about the assumption that everyone wants one thing, I think that you're saying that people want at least the options, or the freedom to have those discussions about options.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So for the podcast, what specific topics or aspects of relationships have been the most popular with your listeners over the years?
I guess I would say, gosh, communication is the low-hanging fruit, and that's definitely the thing that I think we talk about the most, just how to better communicate with your partner, especially in times of conflict, how to let your partner know exactly what it is that you need from them while in conflict, or just even a conversation. If you're having a difficult time, what is it that you want to get out of a conversation with your partner? I think so many times we tend to jump to, let me fix it, let me make this better somehow. And so often our partners simply just want love and care and for you to hold them and things along those lines. So I think all of that has really resonated with our audience. We've also taken a lot of existing models from monogamy and sort of tailored them and changed them slightly to work for non-monogamous relationships as well, which has been a really fun and very beneficial thing, I think, to our audience over the years. But on the flip side, there are models within non-monogamy that we have tried to tailor almost to any type of relationship model that you want to be in at any different time. You said something about changing your relationship structure over time as well. The three of us, when we started this podcast, were in a relationship with each other, and then that changed, and I'm now not non-monogamous anymore. I'm in a monogamous relationship, while Jase and Dedeker are still polyamorous. So again, I think our podcast and the things that we talk about have morphed over time in that way as well, to be more inclusive of whatever type of relationship structure you're in.
Now, you mentioned communication. This might sound very basic, but why is communication so important? And from what you've seen from or heard from podcast listeners, or just observed in your lives or other people's lives, where do you think communication most often goes awry in relationships?
Oh my goodness. I think that communication most often goes awry when we have competing assumptions about expectations. And that's a very, very broad statement. But I think about the fact that we live fairly atomized, individualized lives these days, especially since the Industrial Revolution, where it's no longer this case of, oh, I grew up in this really, really tiny community where we all witnessed similar relationship models or family making models, and we all share a certain amount of community values and a certain amount of community language. And so if I'm partnering with somebody, chances are we come from a very similar background. And so maybe we don't need to as explicitly state what it is that we're feeling, because maybe we can kind of get by on assuming what the other person is feeling. And I think as time has gone on and the way that we live in communities and create family structures has gotten much different and much more separated and atomized, like I was saying earlier, I think it just means that all of us come from very, very different backgrounds. So both macro cultural backgrounds and microcultural backgrounds, like we get very different lessons about how do we resolve conflict. We get very different lessons about how do we raise children, how do we discipline children, how do we care for a relationship when we've already been together for 20 years, how do we run a home together. Like we can come from these very, very different backgrounds. And then when we come together in relationship, it's almost like we can be speaking very, very different languages. The phrase that I use or the body language that I use can land on you very differently than maybe what I'm intending for it to mean. And so, I think that's why it is the low-hanging fruit, is that we keep coming back to it time and time and time again, that we need to be able to be more direct and really lay things out and really strive for mutual understanding in a relationship. And this phenomenon, I think, gets multiplied times 1,000 whenever you're in a relationship that isn't the default mainstream model, like especially if you're playing around with relationship anarchy or polyamory or even swinging, where suddenly we're stepping into a territory where we don't have the same number and frequency of cultural models around how this relationship should go. We don't have the same models around relationship milestones, right? We don't even have a lot of role models necessarily for healthy, consensual, ethical non-monogamy. And so we all kind of have to get in there and negotiate, well, what are you interested in? Well, what am I interested in? Well, what scares me? Well, what excites me? Well, what is something I want to try, but I'm not sure about yet? It's like we really have to do the work of digging into having those conversations, right? And the more effectively we can communicate that, the easier it is to negotiate a relationship where everyone involved is able to at least get an approximation of what it is that they're wanting and are interested in.
I think just one piece I'd want to add to that, and the reason why I think communication is so important in any kind of relationship is largely because like we're kind of given these role models, like Dedeker was saying, but we're not ever really given role models about good communication. Like if you think about the plot of most movies and TV shows, and I'm not even going to say like most romantic comedies, but like most period, if people just communicated honestly earlier on, most movies would be like 15 minutes long and it's all resolved and everything's fine. That it's just like something that we're so not taught how to do, even in that like not only are we not taught explicitly how to do it, but we're also not shown that communication is a thing people do. And we're raised with this ridiculous idea that if you find the right person, they'll just sort of know what you need at any given moment. And it's just ridiculous for any kind of relationship. And so I think that's part of why we put such an emphasis on it, is because it's not something that we grew up necessarily knowing how to do well. And that we probably all learned a lot of really bad habits. And so it's such an important thing to consciously approach and learn how to do those things better so that we don't, make a 3-hour dramatic movie out of a 10-minute conversation we could have had.
And I think going along with what you just said, Jase, about this assumption that once you've found, quote unquote, the one, they'll just be able to read your mind or just know you.
Exactly.
I'm curious if you can talk about how these communication issues change over time, because I think it might seem like communication just automatically gets better over time. But I think for some people, and whatever the relationship structure, it's the opposite, because there is that assumption that, the longer you've been together, the better they should know you, which assumes that nobody's changing at all. And also that, that's just not realistic. So I think sometimes it can be harder to talk about certain fraught or potentially fraught topics or touchy or just where you're not sure what the person thinks because you assume that you should know or or that you think you'll know what they're going to say. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or advice on maybe having some potentially not dicey, but just uncertain conversations, especially around changing a relationship structure or trying something new sexually or along those lines, like into the relationship. I don't know exactly how long, but not in the first few months.
Yeah, so it's so interesting because I know we encountered a study a while ago when we were doing some episode research that showed that over time in long-term relationships, we think that we get better at predicting what our partner is thinking and feeling or what they're going to do at any given moment. And we actually get worse over time, not because, of course, we're building intimacy and we're getting to know someone and we're getting closer to them and we're getting to know their quirks, their strengths, their weaknesses over time. But part of the problem is that we develop a narrative. We develop a much more fixed narrative about who they are, what they want, how their brain works. And that's what gets in the way of us actually being able to predict how our partner is thinking and feeling. And so I think for myself, especially ever since reading that study, I find myself just trying to remember to check myself all the time in relationship, especially in my long-term relationships, of knowing I have a particular story about this person. And maybe it's not 100% inaccurate, but it's also probably not 100% accurate. So I can't necessarily jump to a conclusion around, oh, he's going to react this way, or oh, she's definitely going to say this, or he's going to make this particular decision. It's like you have to build this muscle to always coming back to at least somewhat of an open mind when it comes to your partner and still making an effort to understanding where they're coming from, to understanding their thought process instead of just assuming that you know what their thought process is or what their feelings are. And then when it comes to, dicey conversations like, hey, let's try something different in our relationship, or maybe let's try a different structure. I do think a lot of people are struck by the fact that something that non-monogamy in particular opens up is this opportunity for the two of you to be more of independent beings with an independent identity, separate from each other. And it means sort of breaking out of the narrative maybe that your partner has of you or that you have of your partner. It means they go and have maybe a more independent life, like they're going on dates. Maybe they're traveling with other partners or just hooking up with other people. And that can be both scary on the one hand. It can be scary to feel like, whoa, this person I felt so close to is now maybe just like a slightly different person. Like maybe there's these other aspects of them, maybe they're, engaging in interests and hobbies that I didn't know they had an interest in, now that we're dating other people or things like that. And also at the same time, I think it can be really sexy and really exciting, like to know that so many years into a relationship, you can still be discovering somebody and discovering new aspects of them. This is something that Esther Perel talks about a lot in her work, about us in relationship wanting that desire to feel intimate and close and safe, but we also want a sense of space and mystery, right? Over intimacy can lead to boredom. So for me, I feel like that's kind of an inherent tension. If I don't know if tension is the best word, but it's like this push-pull in a lot of alternative relationship structures that, again, can be scary, but also really exciting at the same time.
That brings me to something I wanted to ask you about, which is relationship check-ins, which you talk a lot about in the book. Can you give the audience an overview of the radar model of relationship check-ins that you advocate and why you think that's so important? And do you think that all relationships should practice check-ins, like regardless of whether things are currently going well or you're currently having issues? Because I think for a lot of people, they only feel like it's a time to check in when there is a stumbling block.
Yeah, one of the last chapters in our book is our radar model, which is something that we developed over many, many years. And it's an acronym, so it stands for basically review, agree the agenda, discuss action points, and then reconnect. And that's just sort of the model and the timeline in which the steps that you do over the course of the relationship check-in. So you're essentially agreeing to review what happened since the last time you had your check-in, and then you have kind of points to talk about. You discuss those things, you make action points for the next time throughout perhaps the month. If it's going on over the course of a month, you're like, okay, I want to be better at checking in with you more frequently, perhaps while I'm on dates with another person. So if I'm out, I have an action point of, writing you a text before I go to bed or something. Or we're going to endeavor to have sex 3 times this month instead of 2. Let's see how we do then. And then because, these relationship check-ins can be challenging, we always include that reconnect step, which we believe is really, really important so that you can kind of pat yourselves on the back and reconnect and tell yourselves a job well done, and also be able to, maybe go out for a fancy dinner or have sex or do something to come back together in the relationship, especially if it was a challenging radar. And I think it's so important. We were joking earlier today that radar is, or not radar, but relationship check-ins have kind of become the new hotness recently, that we've seen it show up on TikTok and Instagram and various places. Even though we've, developed this in 2017, it seems to be something that a lot of people are talking about. And I think it's so important because, again, like we were just saying, you don't always know what your partner's internal life is, what they're going through. And so we talk about things throughout the radar, like what travel plans, what is going on in your job? Are there any money issues that are happening? What's occurring with your other partners or your other close relationships? Things that on a daily basis you don't necessarily want to go through constantly, that you don't want to necessarily take the time, especially if it's a volatile or potentially emotionally challenging topic. But instead, you can have this sort of safe space, this sort of container and time in which you can speak about these things every single month and know, like, okay, we get to sit down, we get to really take time on our relationship right now and talk about this. And then again, like you said, if something great is happening, that's also a time to celebrate those wonderful things that are occurring.
Yeah, I think to answer the second part of your question about when people should do it, I think that what's cool about it is that it takes away some of the stress of that we need to have a talk conversation. That, if the only time you ever have a relationship check-in or a serious talk is when something's bad, you develop that association, which I think many of us already have, of if someone says, I want to talk about our relationship, it's, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, this is going to be terrible. This is going to be stressful. I've done something wrong, or they're breaking up with me, or something terrible has happened. And part of radar is, like Emily was saying, you're celebrating what's great as well. And that you're doing it regularly, not just when something's wrong. So I would actually recommend starting it before things are tough, right? Starting it when things are great. It's just like if you ever go to a couples therapist or a counselor as a couple when your relationship is good, and say, yeah, we just want to make sure we're doing well and that we're, making our relationship as good as it can be. Every therapist is going to go, oh my gosh, this is amazing. You're like my dream clients. This is the best thing I could possibly imagine. It's like doing that kind of, let's make sure everything's great while it's great so it can stay as much that way as possible, is so important. And that's part of why we created this structure to be regular, is so that it can be used at any time in any phase of someone's relationship.
And is this something you suggest people do monthly or quarterly, or does it depend on their particular needs?
Yeah, our standard is monthly, but you can adjust it to whatever you need. So an example would be, say you've been in a monogamous relationship and you're opening it up. You might want to do this every week. right? To really have a lot more frequent check-ins to try to figure out what you're doing together. And if it's maybe a long distance partner that you don't see as often, maybe you would do it less often. Or just if you're busy, sure, like Dedeker and I often will push ours to 2 months, even though we try to do them every month. But having some kind of regularness and scheduling the next one at the previous one is really helpful, because that way, if something comes up during that month or 2 months or week or whatever, you know, oh, we have one coming up, so I'll wait, and I know I will get to talk about it then. So it takes away some of that stress of, when do we talk about this thing? When do I bring this up?
I think the important thing is just there's some sort of repeatability, some sort of regularity to the ritual of checking in for a number of reasons. One of them being that, like, you always have this established container where we know there's a space for us to talk about issues that have come up. Maybe, if an issue comes up, but we're in the middle of like trying to get the kids in the car to go down and visit the grandparents or whatever, and we can't unpack it right in that moment. We know, like, oh, a week from now, we're going to have a check-in. So we can just kind of enjoy our day right now and not worry about that, right? So having that regularity is actually pretty calming to our nervous systems, which is really helpful for a sense of safe attachment in a relationship. But also, another part of it is a complaint that I often hear from people when I'm working with them in their relationships is it could be something like, yeah, so I brought up this complaint to my partner and I asked them, hey, can you do this thing to change it? And they said, yeah, totally. And now it's been crickets. I haven't seen anything. And so I don't know, do I bring it up again? Do I harangue them about it? Do I just wait and see if they're going to change anything? Right. But if you have something that's regular, you essentially have in these built-in points to be able to check in and say, okay, cool. So at our last check-in, we talked about we're going to try this thing, to make our mornings a little bit less stressful when we're both trying to get ready, right? And, oh, okay, so we did that for like a week, but then we kind of stopped doing it. We forgot to do it. Did it not really work for us? Did we just forget? Is there something different we could be trying? Like, the idea that you can always be following up. Oh,
Whoops.
Very passionate
I'm
about this.
just so passionate, so zealous about check-ins. Wow.
I'm amazed that happened.
Yeah, let me reset. So you always have an opportunity to be following up and making sure that the things that we're deciding to do together to actually affect positive change in our relationship is actually happening, instead of just getting forgotten about in the shuffle of life. That's one of my favorite aspects about having a regular check-in, is that built-in process.
So another topic that you have a chapter dedicated to that I thought was especially important is boundaries. Can you give an overview of the difference between boundaries and rules, and an example of like a common topic that people form boundaries around?
Boy, yeah. I mean, clearly we could write a whole chapter and record probably many hours of podcasts.
Well,
about
actually, can
this.
I just jump in really quick to say that our episode 372, which we recorded in May of 2022, that's in the top 5 of our most downloaded episodes of the past like 5 years or so. So that's
Yeah,
a
all
hot
about
topic.
boundaries.
Yeah, boundaries
Yep,
is a big deal.
boundaries
Uh-huh.
for sure. Yeah, I guess rather than focus too much on those definitions right away, one thing that we kind of like to cover here is that boundaries, like anything else, are an important concept to understand and a tool to use to improve your relationships and to improve your communication with the people that you love and care about, and even your more distant relationships too. Boundaries can show up there, but that they're not, by their nature, like the perfect solution to things. So to go to your question of the difference between boundaries and rules, for example, is that a rule is something that we either agree together, maybe we put on ourselves, but it's like a clear, don't do this, or something happens. Like, there tends to be a punishment associated with a rule, even if that punishment is kind of implied, like I'll be mad at you, or I'll break up with you, or something is sort of this implied consequence of it. But this rule is this idea of a limitation that's getting put on somebody else. Or maybe you're putting it on yourself, but it's like a limitation getting put on like from yourself, but externally, or maybe by someone else put on you. On the other hand, we have an agreement, which an agreement might be, we say, hey, you know what, we're just going to agree that, if we're ever going to go on a date with somebody else, that I'll let you know about it before I go on the date, right? Something simple like that. Maybe we have a plan there, or it might be an agreement about something else, about how we share the labor of picking up the kid or cleaning up the house or something like that. That's kind of like, yeah, we plan to do this thing, but there's not quite the same sense of, and if you don't, there will be consequences. It's more like, okay, we've agreed to do this thing. So it's a little, maybe of a more teamwork oriented way to approach it. And then boundaries, the way that we talk about boundaries is that boundaries are something that are by yourself, for yourself, and are enforced completely by yourself. So if you say like, oh, I put a boundary on this person, to us, that means that's not a boundary. That means what you actually want is a rule, or you want to be able to tell them what to do or something. That a boundary is something you're able to completely enforce unilaterally. So maybe an extreme example would be something like, my boundary is that I won't be in a relationship with someone who interrupts me. And so if that is your boundary, that means that if that happens, you're the one who protects yourself by not being in that relationship. And I think for a lot of people, they're like, yikes, wait, hold on, I don't want to do that. And so that's kind of a way to evaluate a relationship. Whereas for you, maybe that is really serious. And in which case, yeah, if someone's interrupting you, that is a relationship you might need to end, whether that is a friend or a romantic relationship or whatever. So the reason why I gave all that preface beforehand is that because boundaries sort of became this hot topic recently, people will often call something a boundary in order to just say, oh, well, it's a boundary, so therefore you can't argue with it. It's just inherently right. It's good. You can't do anything about it. And so we see them used a lot in the same way that rules can be used in a negative way, or just being controlling or manipulative can be used in a cruel, unhealthy way. And so I don't want people to get too hung up on kind of like, oh, well, if it fits this definition, then it's good. But it's more that a boundary is your last line of defense. It's the thing that you do to protect yourself from unhealthy, hurtful situations. And ideally, in a good relationship, you won't hit those boundaries very often, if at all, right? That they're kind of this last line of defense. They're a thing that helps you get really clear on what your values are and, how to keep yourself safe. But that a good relationship should be coming from that place of, yeah, we want to talk about how we can make each other happy, how we can be doing the best to support each other, not how can we just barely make this tolerable. And so that's kind of, I think boundaries are super important, but part of the goal of them is by getting clear, you hopefully don't actually run into them or need to use them in your daily life within your relationships.
Makes sense. So your subtitle of your book is Essential Tools for Modern Multiamory, Essential Tools for Modern Relationships. I'm curious who you see as your target audience for the book. Would you say it's more people in longer term relationships, or people just starting out, or even people who maybe are single but are planning to be in a relationship soon or at some point?
Gosh, honestly, I feel like we tried to create this book for anyone, and not only people who want to be in relationships that are romantic, but people who want to be in better relationships with their parents, with their friends, with their coworkers, because none of them are specifically romantic based. I think a lot of them, yes, you might not necessarily have a boundary conversation or a monthly check-in with your mail carrier, but you may want to have one with your roommate, for example. So I think it's something that our podcast has done over, the last 9 years that we've been doing it, is it's evolved to become a lot more inclusive of all types of relationships. And with that, I think we started also using and talking about these tools in ways that aren't just for people who want to be in romantic relationships. So if you are interested and willing and able to look at relationships as not something that only one type of person can do, only people who are interested in monogamy, for instance, and can maybe broaden your horizons out to know that relationships are going to look a lot of different ways, and the people who are involved in them are going to look a lot of different ways and be a lot of different types of people. That's who this book is for, people who are okay and excited to go there and to read about, you know, people in LGBTQ relationships, people who are polyamorous, people who are monogamous, all of the above.
Yeah, I would jump on that to clarify that if you're reading this book, you have to at least be comfortable with the existence of non-monogamy.
Sure.
Yeah, this book is not a non-monogamy manual. This book is not at all us proselytizing about non-monogamy being better. Like it's really not about non-monogamy. We use a lot of non-monogamy examples, but all these tools are meant to be customizable and applicable to people in a wide variety of relationships. Ultimately, our main goal is that people just feel empowered to be able to find a solution to their communication woes in their relationship, to find, even if it's a tool, it doesn't even have to be all of the tools in the book, but a tool that resonates with them and works for the situation that they're in. That's what we want, is just to give people a sense of being able to pick up a tool and apply it.
And the book is coming out May 23rd. Can you tell us what's next for you? Any plans around the book launch? And then where can people find you collectively and each of you individually?
Yeah, so book's coming out on May 23rd, and at multiamory.com/book, we have links for, where you can pre-order that before it comes out or after it comes out, where you can get it. But we also have a couple live events for the book release. One that's in Seattle on May 24th. So the day after the book comes out, we're doing an event in Seattle, and then we're doing one in Los Angeles the week after on May 30th. So if you're in either of those areas or want an excuse to take a trip to the West Coast, then go check that out at multiamory.com/book.
And then what about each of you? You're on Instagram, the podcast, Multiamory_podcast. And if people want to follow each of you individually, do you have places they can do that?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, people can find me at Dedeker Winston pretty much in all the social media platforms. Just make sure that you spell it correctly. I also offer coaching. I work with individuals, I work with couples, and then I also work with triads as well. So you can go to dedekerwinston.com if you're interested in that.
Yeah, you can.
I think...
Sorry, you can find me on Instagram at EMSOTELO. I'm also an actor and a singer, and that's what I do besides all of this every single week. So I have updates and stuff on there as well on my Instagram page.
Yeah, and for me, just go to Multiamory. I feel like that's where we put a lot of our effort. I will give one plug that we do have one other podcast called Drunk Bible Study. That's a totally different kind of show. But if you enjoy us and want to hang out with us some more, it's a really fun show where we get together every week, and we do it live on Twitch, where we read the Bible and drink and talk about how we would cast the most epic Bible movie ever made.
It's very silly.
I did not know that. So thank you to explore. So everyone, Multiamory, the podcast, you can listen to their episodes now, and the book is out on May 23rd. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.